This is the story of a Kazakh nomadic pastoralist migration in the Altai mountains that took place last fall or last year, 2003, and takes place every year for as long as we know, maybe for the last 2,000 years. What's quite remarkable about this migration and this traveling tradition, nomadic pastoralist tradition, is it's been continuing as far as we know for over 2,000 years, and it continues to take place every year. And among these Kazakhs, it might take place as often as 60 to 80 times per year. Now this is remarkable because there are very few completely nomadic populations left in the world. And as far as we know, among Kazakhs, only in China and this region of the Altai Mountains do we have this extraordinarily high number of people migrating so many times a year. Why do they do this? It's because they're poor. As Owen Lattimore once said, the only pure nomad is a poor nomad. And so we expect that as China's economy develops and the government seeks to develop this region and economically assist these people, this way of life will pass away. So that is why I traveled with them on several occasions. This particular migration was to the summer pasture in the Altai Mountains near the border of Mongolia, and I followed them on horseback. I had one other Kazakh with me, helping me with logistics, and spent several weeks in the late summer, late August, early September, following this one group of nomadic pastoralists, most of them members of the Sarbas tribe. There I am, managing to stay on top of my Mongolian pony. It was quite cold this time of year. In fact, we had to end our trip early because of snow that came in the pass. Actually had to start down the mountain quite early. You can see that a typical family will have at least 6 camels and the occasional anthropologist who follows along, but there'll be several other younger camels that will follow as well, and a wealthy family might have as many as 20 or 30. This is a few households that will travel together. What we have seen is that as these Kazakhs get wealthier, the government encourages them to settle and to sedentarize. So it's important to document this kind of migration and to try to understand how it is you can encourage their development, but also try to preserve this traditional form of subsistence that has been taking place for generations. As you can see, the women are leading the camel train because they're carrying the household, and women have the traditional role of carrying the household. Now this migration is a large migration. I was able to document it with GPS from a lower elevation of about 1,000 meters up to the top there you see on your screen of about 3,000 meters between August 25th and September 15th, 2003, out of Fuyun County, an area known as Durei Village on the Mongolian-China border. This migration takes place in the summertime up to the summer pasture, and in the winter down to the winter pasture near the Gobi Desert. These pastoralists move quite frequently due to the radical shift in weather, climatic conditions, and frequent changes in weather, as well as the elevation change. They have to get over this path, 3,000 meter paths, in order to get into a summer pasture that is near the border of Mongolia. So it's very far, and they have to keep moving. That's why they move so often. They take the frequent breaks, which they do not set the yurt up. This is a tea break, and basically you have the traditional Kazakh milk tea, and then breads that have been deep fried, and cheeses that have been dried in the sun, and maybe some yogurt. Generally only eat a hot meal in the evening when they've settled in camp, and they're able to set up some tents and generally kill a sheep, in which case they'll have a boiled mutton, almost no vegetables in the area. You can see that they start learning this pastoral way of life very young. This is a young boy about 5 years old, already learning how to herd sheep, and his father's sort of joking about it. Also, you'll notice no fences in this area. In this pastoralist area, once you leave the Dure village environs, you do not see any fences. You see some corrals where they'll pin up the livestock to protect them from wolves in the area, but you'll not see any fences. What you do see, however, is an entire family traveling together. Generally children that are prior to school age, prior to the age of 8 or so, till the age of 14, will stay with the elderly or the infirm down in the village area. They'll have more permanent dwellings, wooden or in some cases even brick houses, where the children will go to school during the school year. But if it's outside of the school year, such as the summertime, or if the children are younger or older, out of school, or the elderly are still able to travel, you'll see them all with the entire family on the seasonal migration, particularly up into the summer pasture, because it's a lovely area. It's a strenuous migration. 16-hour days are not unusual for the Kazakh pastoralists. A very clear division of labor. The women stay with the camels and the household. The men are off herding the sheep, the horses, and the cattle, which often will take a slightly different migration route depending on the sort of grade, the steepness of the trail, etc. The camels that you see here are completely used for transport. You rarely see a Kazakh riding a camel. They ride the horses. They are quite proud of their horses, and their horsemanship is tremendous. Of course, there's courtship between men and women that takes place on the horseback, and all kinds of rituals. Now, as this camel train approaches the summit, you'll see a map series that will enable you to see the full extent of their migration. The top arrow on the right is the summit, and this shorter arrow on the left is actually from Tony Banks's research, where he studied grassland utilization patterns in a neighboring valley among pastoral Kazakhs. He mapped out the summer pasture in the north as opposed to the winter pasture in the south, and showed that the grassland utilization patterns had altered dramatically over the years. What we can see from this series of maps, courtesy of Google Earth's program, is that the pastoralists move a great distance from the southern pasture in the fall and spring, as you see in the lower part of your screen, up into the summer pasture near the border of Mongolia. Again, this map shows you the full extent of the migration over 60 to 80 times per year, down into the winter pasture right on the edge of the Gobi Desert. So here we see that they've moved an annual migration of nearly 60 to 80 times. The importance of the tent, known most popularly in the West as a yurt, but actually that's a Turkish word. The Kazakhs here, they call it basically a Kyrgyz yu, and yu just means household. They don't use the Mongolian word ger, which is often a word you hear quite frequently in the literature. In this area they use mostly Kazakh terms yu for family or household. Kyrgyz yu may be related to the ancient word for the Kazakhs, who share a great history, a long history with the Kyrgyz. Some Kazakhs at one point were known as Kara Kyrgyz or Black Kyrgyz. So it's not unusual that this would be considered a Kyrgyz household. Important to the household is the door, in which the kana or the lattice work walls are attached. These trellises, these lattices are attached by felt and woven cloth or woven ropes. And basically what we're seeing now is they're setting up a smaller version of the ger or the yurt for more temporary shelter. This family, interestingly enough, has just 2 daughters, and they're somewhat poor by local standards. since they do not have any sons. They do not have enough camels to haul their entire household. So he's basically taking down his larger size yurt, which you'll see in the next segment, and he's condensing it into a smaller yurt. This is a 4-walled or 4-khana yurt. Most of the regular normal size yurt is 6 of these lattice walls. He has a solar panel electrical generator which provides 4 to 6 hours of low voltage, low wattage electricity every night. You can run a light, you can run a small radio or even a tape player. This is the full extent of globalization that you find in this region, though there's more and more plastics and bottles that you'll see. You rarely see any motorcycles up this far because it's really impossible to transport the fuel. Though in the lower elevations you'll see quite a lot of motorcycles and trucks and cars, things like that. This is much more traditional style. Most of the objects are all made by hand. These solar power radios were actually given to this area by a Shell Oil Corporation project to the Dutch government. As far as I could tell, the only impact these radios are making, or the solar power radios are making, is just to give them a little more light in the evening, which stories are told like they would have been around the campfire. I didn't see anybody reading in the evening. People are too exhausted and the wattage is pretty low to read. It wasn't enough to power my laptop, though in the lower elevations they had gas-powered generators that you could charge up laptops and things like that, charge batteries. In this case, they used it to listen to tapes, mostly Kazakh music. There were no audio tapes or Islamic sermons, for that matter, that I could hear. The Kazakhs are Muslims. They are nomadic in tradition, so there are no mosques. In the towns and in the villages where there are mosques, they will attend them. But you rarely see Kazakhs praying 5 days. There's always a prayer before the meal, thanking God for his provision. And often the Kazakh yurt will be oriented with the door facing away from Mecca, so that the yurt itself is oriented towards Mecca, towards the west in this case, sometimes also towards the south, though I think in this case it's more the orientation is to the west. Kazakhs are deeply religious. They're devout Muslims, but they do have pre-Islamic traditions that they maintain, as every Muslim culture does. In their case, there's veneration of sort of sacred spaces, rocks, trees, rivers, where there are certain spirits that are thought to be powerful, and they're placated or venerated through tying of string to boughs of trees, etc. Not unlike Tibetan Buddhist practice that you see in Tibetan prayer flags. What you're seeing is they're basically putting the yurt together through adding these to the lattice work. To the khana, they add these struts or poles known as uyuk, sometimes uni, and these poles will be tied to the lattice work using woven rope and just pierced together among the cloth in the center. What you'll see in the next segment is the use of the dome, or the shanirach, the very famous Kazakh top that goes to the yurt, which you'll see. In this case, the entire household can be pulled apart very quickly. Watching this yurt be built in about 2 hours, 2.5 hours, and can be taken down in about 45 minutes, though packing everything up and loading on the camels takes 2 to 3 hours if you're actually moving early in the morning. The whole family takes part in this process, although generally the young men would be out taking care of the sheep and the goats. Now this, as I mentioned, is a somewhat poorer family because they don't have sons, they don't have enough camels. A kind of middle-class Kazakh family would aspire to have at least 6 camels to haul the entire household, ideally about 10 with several other younger camels on the way. 10 to 20 is the ideal. 200 to 300 head of sheep, including about 10, 15 goats. Also, ideally having 10 to 20 horses for herding. Although Kazakhs will eat horse meat, generally dried and made into sausages, though I did not see any horses being eaten on this trip. I've eaten quite a lot of Kazakh horse meat but you don't see horses being slaughtered very often. It's not something they enjoy, but it's a necessity. And finally, about 50 head of cattle they would like to have, and mostly used for their dairy products. So they will certainly eat the meat as well and use the leather. Most of the livestock is sold or traded, generally with Uyghur buyers who come up in trucks from towns nearby. The Uyghurs will come up and bargain with the Kazakhs. Kazakhs will meet them at certain pickup points and sell them sheep or cattle, and often barter, sometimes for grain or vegetables. But generally it's a cash-based economy. And again, a middle-class Kazakh will aspire to having 300 to 500 head of sheep. Did meet some very wealthy Kazakh families with 3,000 to 5,000 sheep in one family. So that's not unheard of, but it's pretty rare in this area. Again, as Kazakhs become more wealthy, they tend to want to settle down, to live in a house, to have a cell phone, to have a car. So this kind of lifestyle will certainly die out as the area becomes increasingly wealthy. And you can already see a lot more money in the area with not just the radios, but everybody seems to have, within the larger family, has a cell phone that does work on some mountaintops and does work in the city. We all have motorcycles now, and generally brick houses down in the towns. But nevertheless, this tradition of pastoral nomadism, it continues. And with China's rise in income, the desire for sheep and lamb meat and mutton and dairy byproducts is increasing. So there is a lot more money in the economy. What they're doing is they're attaching two large pieces of felt, again handmade. You can see a piece of bone is holding that strap on the felt cloth. Two pieces of felt go on top of the roof of the yurt, and they're draped over there, and then they're adjusted, and all of this can be easily adjusted. In case it rains, you can close it up. If it's hot, you can open it up a little bit. Although most of the time, even in the hottest of weather, Kazakhs do not like to raise the sides as you see in some tents. Here's the second piece that's going on. Now, what's important about this tradition of the yurt is that it has a very long history. What we've seen among nomadic pastoralists is two kinds of tent nomadism. In Eurasia and Inner-Asia, Central Asia, we find this dome style, the rounded tent with the tent poles, and probably the origins of the teepee that we see in the American Northwest, these poles attached together. Though the rounded shanirok, which you'll see in the next segment, did not seem to have made it over across the Bering Strait. This tent style nomadism, the rounded tent, is distinct from the other common method of tent dwelling, which is the black-topped tent, the black, flat tent that you see among Tibetans, among Persians, among Bedouins, and in Eastern and Northern Africa. So basically, these two styles of nomadism, of tent dwelling, have long histories that are quite distinct. One important article by a scholar, David Stronach, at University of California, Berkeley, an archaeologist, has shown that this kind of rounded tent dwelling nomadism extends back, as far as we know, to the first millennium BC, where he found archaeological evidence on the basis of tomb frescoes and etchings. There's the famous Arjan bowl that was discovered in a tomb, which is actually shaped like a domed tent with this kind of design on the inside of the tent like we see in a contemporary Kazakh nomads. We've seen 2nd century Sogdian drawings and descriptions of these tents. So we know it has a very long history. What's remarkable is that it still continues, to some extent almost unchanged, for over 2,000 years. What has changed to some extent is when the pastoralists are down in the towns, and then their lives have changed radically. But up in the mountains, and when they're in there moving with the herds, this kind of lifestyle is virtually unchanged. You can see how easily adjusted the felt tarps on top of the tent can be made, depending on the weather, depending on the climate. They're about done. They've taken the stove out. They'll probably keep that outside and do all the cooking outside the tent. When they have the larger tent, you see the stove on the inside of the tent, which is used for heating and boiling water, not really too much for cooking. Most of the cooking, particularly the boiling, making of yogurt, boiling milk, making the mutton, boiled mutton, is done outside the tent. Taking down the yurt is even faster. In this segment, this is actually the same family that we came upon about a few hours earlier, and they were just starting to take down the large yurt, and they were condensing it into the small yurt. What they were doing was they were going to take part of it apart so they could give it to his brother-in-law in order to transport the materials on their camels, since, as I mentioned, this family was rather poor and didn't have enough camels to transport their entire yurt. So here you see the two large felt pieces being removed, and the central dome is still on top of the tent. Fantastic setting. We're about 2,000 meters up, about 6,000-7,000 feet. And again, the highest point that this family would reach is over the pass. It's about 3,000 meters, a little over 9,000 feet. And that's where we got snow. So they're already starting their downward migration at the end of August, early September, because the weather turned quite cold. Now you can see the straps are used to hold the tent together, woven wool straps, intricately designed, and then this applique is generally attached to the outside of the felt tarps, as well as the outside of these matting that is used, often made out of reed or straw. You can see on the inside it's decorated, but not on the outside. Sometimes both sides are decorated depending on how much money the family has, etc. You can see in the foreground there's a small loom that had been set up for weaving and repairing the rope. These tents are in constant need of repair. There's the loom, just sort of set up very quickly, transported very easily. You're seeing more newer looms up in the region today, wooden looms, etc., even some hand-cranked sort of looms. It's metal. This family is quite poor, so they have more of the traditional kinds of equipment. You can see it's packed up for transport very quickly, and this large yurt can be taken apart in about an hour, and the very small family. The walls of the yurt, the khana, the lattice work, and in this case, a regular size yurt, about 6 of these walls are then collapsed and strapped alongside generally on the sides of the camel. These felt tarps are stacked on the backs of the camel and the stove tied on top on a separate, and generally the lead camel, you'll have the shiny rock. Here you can see the shiny rock, sometimes known in Turkic as a tokhana. Here the Shiny Rock is clearly seen to be holding the struts, the poles, the uyuk poles together. And because of this, the top of this yurt is thought to be an important symbol for the history of the Kazakhs. You'll find this symbol to be on many Kazakh emblems, particularly the Kyrgyz flag has this shaniyak. Kyrgyz, Kazakh have a long, close history of nomadic tradition. And on the Kazakhstan seal, the state seal, there's this emblem of the shaniraks. The idea is that this is the only part of the yurt that does not collapse, is not taken apart. It's handed down from father to son and to grandson, and becomes a symbol to the unity of the Kazakh family and the nation. Here you see the flap that is often tied up above the door. This flap can be very ornate in some circumstances, often decorated on the inside so that you see it from the inside. And again, reattached to felt backing. And then a rope strap that attaches through the shaniyak. Here you see the applique. Beautiful Kazakh designs, this floral pattern, sometimes a pomegranate pattern. The door can be quite ornate, a wooden door, hand carved. In this case, again, the family is not very well off, so it's much more simple, functional wooden door. In some cases, you see extraordinarily ornate hand carved doors. The tent is pitched on the bare ground, often returning to similar places where they've been before. Now, this becomes a problem. How many Kazakhs this valley can accommodate, size of herds, carrying capacity. Dr. Tony Banks, agricultural developmental economist in New Zealand, has written a thesis about the Kazakhs in the Altai Mountains in a neighboring region, not in this region. The Kazakhs he studied move 20 to 30 times a year, a much shorter migration pattern than the ones that I traveled with. But very similar issues prevail, and basically in Dr. Tony Banks's thesis, he discussed the whole debate about the tragedy of the commons, whether or not this area is being subjected to overgrazing as a result of increased herd size due to the monetary economy, that the value of the sheep and the wool products has increased dramatically in the last 10 to 20 years in China's market economy. To the extent that this kind of lifestyle is declining, it's becoming more commercialized, and herds are increasing. Again, you see this wonderful pattern on the inside of the matting that is used to provide warmth and support to the yurt structure, to the Kazan walls, to the Kana walls. And the Kazan stove, Kazan I mentioned, is here in the middle of the yurt. You can still see it's there, generally with a stovepipe that runs up the middle, and the flaps will be generally left open in order to have circulation. Tony Banks' thesis basically has argued that the well-established theory of the tragedy of the commons does not really apply in this kind of environment, because the carry capacity of the grass and the pasture zones is so diverse. It's very hard to demonstrate what the level of the carrying capacity is. In some areas, I think more over where Tony Banks was working, farther west than this. I was more on the Mongolian border. His regions extended up towards the northern Russian border, and I would think more towards the Kazakhstan border of the Altai Mountains. You have more overgrazing problems. You have higher populations of people, greater numbers of livestock. In this region, you do not see the kind of environmental degradation that you see in these other areas, probably because of population size. The government wants to turn this area into a tourist area because it is so pristine and it is so beautiful. And of course, there's the issue of migration. When the Kazakhs leave the spring and fall pasture areas, they're moving much farther south into populated areas. And there you have a lot of conflicts with farmers, mostly Uyghur farmers, and some Kazakh, but mostly Uyghur farmers, who feel that the livestock does get into their fields. In some cases, they've had to enforce strict regulation But for the most part, this area, there's been a fairly equitable distribution of grazing land and farming land. And they haven't had the kinds of overgrazing issues and conflicts that we've seen that has led to the tragedy of the commons theory being discussed widely in these other Kazakh areas, particularly in Inner Mongolia, where you have pastoralists who have been restricted from fencing, and that's led to the overgrazing of infenced areas. Anthropologist D. McWilliams has written quite extensively about this. The importance of this area is the fact that the government has tried to regulate not only how many heads of sheep and livestock, but also when migrations take place. And it's monitored quite carefully by government officials, most of whom at the lower level are Kazakh. At the county and village level, all of the government officials I met were Kazakh, including the county chairman and the party secretary. At higher levels, you tend to get Han Chinese, particularly in the party. In this area, the politics are fairly minimal. The government is very strict about forestry. There's very little cutting of trees allowed. Mining, all mining was banned in this region. Also, outsiders are rarely allowed up into this area because of the fear of fire and degradation. So it is fairly strictly monitored. There are gates with locks where you have to migrate, take your herds through, and you do have a lot of signage talking about protecting the forests. Again, this is near the Mongolian border area, lower population, and actually quite beautiful and pristine area. The children seem quite healthy, very little evidence of disease. The real issue is education. Most of the kids get an average of 5 to 6 years of education, and most of them don't begin to learn Chinese until they're in their 12th, 13th, or 14th year, their 6th year of school. Mostly they're all literate in Kazakh, written in Arabic script. Kazakh is a Turkic language, and it's related quite closely to Kyrgyz, all Kipchak branches of Kazakh, of Turkish. And the Kipchak Turkic branches were mostly used among nomadic peoples. The settled Turkic peoples, farming communities, agriculturalists, and urban Turks, mostly Uyghurs, Uzbeks, Tatars, etc., speak a closer related group of Turkic languages that is not too distant from the Istanbul Turkish that I learned. I learned a rudimentary Turkish in Istanbul that was basically enough to communicate, but certainly not fluent in any way with Kazakh. And generally with the younger people, I was using Mandarin Chinese. But with the elderly Kazakhs and the young children, we had to communicate in Kazakh. Here you see the Uyuk poles are coming out, and they're getting ready to remove the shiny rock. They do this very carefully. They don't want to drop it or break it. This is the piece that holds the yurt together and is handed down from father to son and to grandson through the generations. You'll see they attach 2 lines of rope or felt strips to the edges of the shiny rock, and then the father, generally the father, the male, will carry the top of it. You'll lift it on the pole. Very carefully they'll remove the other supporting poles, the uyuk, and they will very carefully pull the straps until he's got it balanced, and then lower it carefully to the ground. Here you see it being lowered. And generally the shiny rock is carried on one of the first camels. What you generally see on the camel trains is 6 camels with the household goods, the stove on one of them, the yuk struts on the others, the kanat walls on lattice work on another camel, and then all the felt pieces tying it together and the bedding, etc. But often on the front camel you will see the shiny rock sitting there in a place of prominence. The camels are generally led by a young woman of childbearing age, generally with a small child in her arms or in a cradle, wooden cradle that can be suspended from the inside of the yurt or set on the ground, very sturdy, known as a beshik in Turkish. These cradles are often handed down and ornately carved, and generally carried by the woman on the horseback in the front of the camel train. Again, young people will often, particularly young women, will watch the camels, and young men will be off with the livestock, the horses and things like that. Fairly clear division of labor between genders. These migration groups are generally 2 or 3 yurts will travel in a train together, and they will be related to each other through the father's line, through the patriline. So it'd be a kin group, that 2 brothers, for example, and their children, or their father's brother, uncles, and their children. And some often have a division of labor. Maybe 2 households will take care of the livestock, and another 2 households will be responsible for taking care of the felt, or moving the yurts, or those kinds of things. This area, most of these were tribal group known as Sarabas, one of the sub-lineages of the Orta Jews, or tribal group, sometimes known as the Middle Horde. But what's quite unique about this part of China is that while traditionally these tribal divisions were very distinct, and you almost never saw groups of different tribal sub-lineages traveling together, it's been fairly mixed up, partly as a result of the history of migration in this area, war, also government policy of redistricting. But to a certain extent, only about 60% of these nomadic pastoralists were members of the Sarabas. There were 2 other large sub-lineages that were represented, which shows a kind of breaking down of the lineage distinctions and divisions. Generally, Kazakhs will not intermarry with anyone within 5 generations of lineage relation with each other. And they have to know very clearly what their lineage history are in order to find a spouse. This is starting to break down, and the divisions are not so great. What is important is a very strong awareness of being Kazakh, and they get this from the school, and also interaction with non-Kazakhs, such as Uyghurs or government representatives who might be Han. So the sense of being a Kazakh nationality, Kazakh Minzu in Chinese, is very strong, while the lineage or kinship differences have broken down. And this has led to a lot of interaction between Kazakhs from Kazakhstan, often of the Ulu, or Great Horde, interacting with members of the Middle Horde, which is almost unheard of historically. In the Kazakh migration, whether as a large collective tribal group in a large horde or as a small household, as we see here, it's important at the very end that the materials are packed properly, particularly the tunduk or the shanirak, which here, as you see, is set aside as a symbol of the whole tribal group. It is the one part of the yurt that is not disassembled, is handed down from generation to generation. So it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and they're up, and they're getting everything ready to move to make it to the next stage, which is somewhere near where we've been staying. The spring pasture. Packing up the light thing. The solar power gave us light almost all evening. simple. But it's transformed their leavings here on the run. That family's almost ready to go. It's a smaller family to handle. I've seen some already on the move. So breakfast is served, and the tea you see that they are pouring is the famous Kazakh milk tea. They generally keep it in these thermoses, make it the night before, and might add a bit of salt to it, almost never sugar. Though as a gift and somewhat of a luxury, I brought quite a bit of rock sugar, candy sugar, and some of them would add that to their tea. I would frequently do this. This young boy, of course, not adding anything to his tea. He's basically drinking yogurt. It was hard to get it away from him. He's so enthusiastic about his breakfast. Again, it's just getting light. It's about 5:30 in the morning, getting ready for this trek down the hill, and they need to have a hearty breakfast. Nothing is cooked in the morning. He's had a very good sleep and packing up the camp. It's not easy to get this entire operation moving. It looks very simple, but the coordination is difficult. Loading up all of the equipment, packing the camels just right. Here, Azati is tightening the saddle. Well, it's not really a saddle, it's just a tie down on the camels. As you go downhill, it has to be much tighter. And this lead camel, unfortunately, was injured on the way over the pass. When we passed this 9,000, 10,000 foot pass, on the way down, it was quite shaly. And a group of Kazakhs, pastoralist nomads on top, much higher than us, knocked down some rocks, and one of the rocks, boulders, fell down the mountain and landed on this camel's foot. These two-toed camels, if you damage one toe, it cannot walk very well, as you can see. This was a major issue. Late into the night, we examined the toe of the camel. The members from the other nomadic group were contacted. You can see the concern on their face. Eventually, what they had to do was cut this camel loose because it was holding up the entire band, the entire herd, and they let it come down on its own. Most of these animals will follow the herd, except for the sheep and the goats. And this is why you need the head goat, or the lead goat. Here he is with his gray beard and his tall horns, and every herd of sheep will have one or two of these lead goats that they pretty much follow. Dogs keep them sort of in a general order, and the shepherd, you can see him here, will follow along either by horseback or on foot. So this lead goat is critical to leading the herd of sheep. Well, we've finished our trip, and our young friend with the bunny hat is leading us home, and hope very much that these Kazakhs will be able to maintain their way of life as well as adapt themselves to the new world that lies ahead.